Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm very pleased to introduce today's event, which is 10 years on from the Yezidi genocide, which is being hosted by the XCEPT research program in conjunction with the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. Today's event is also being hosted as part of Lost and Found, Stories of Sanctuary and Belonging, which is a free program of arts and ideas presented by King's Culture. My name is Sarah Sanbar. I'm the Iraq researcher at Human Rights Watch. And today's panel is going to be reflecting on what life is like for the Yazidi community 10 years after the genocide. We're going to explore what barriers are preventing Yazidis from returning home, from obtaining justice, challenges that have faced those who go back, as well as what the ending of UNITAD's mandate means for efforts to achieve justice. We'll also discuss what needs to be done to support the Yazidi community moving forward. I'm very honored to be joined by such wonderful panelists. Joining us online is Dr. Inna Rudolf. She is a research fellow on the XCEPT project, a senior research fellow at the ICSR, and a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Study of Divided Societies. Her work on the XCEPT project largely focuses on the implications of identity politics and the role of traumatic memories in post-conflict reconciliation. As part of this, Dr. Rudolf has recently published research on the barriers to reconciliation for the Yazidi community in Iraq, which you can read on the ICSR and XCEPT websites. To my left is Mirza Dinnayi. He is a renowned Yazidi human rights advocate, the 2016 laureate of the Golden Stauffer Medal, the 2019 laureate of the Aurora Prize for Awakening Humanity, the founder of the House of Coexistence in Sinjar, Iraq, and a former advisor to the Iraqi president for the affairs of non-Muslim minorities. In addition to all that, he also co-founded the German-based NGO Airbridge Iraq, where he personally evacuated women and children from territories controlled by ISIS, transported them to safety, and delivered food and water to isolated areas. In 2023, Mirza received the U.S. Department of State's International Religious Freedom Award for his role in defending the rights of minority groups and promoting peace, coexistence, and diversity in Iraq. And finally, we have Alannah Travers, who is a journalist and consultant who was based in Iraq between 2021 and 2023, and who previously supported the Coalition for Just Reparations, an alliance of 34 Iraqi NGOs calling for comprehensive reparations for survivors of atrocities perpetrated during the conflict with ISIS in Iraq. She is currently pursuing an LLM in human rights, conflict, and justice at London's SOAS University, specializing in IHL and use of force, prohibitions of torture, and international protection of human rights. Her research is focused on the intersection of Islamic law and human rights, with an emphasis on post-conflict societies. We're going to start this panel with each panelist taking about 10 minutes to speak about their work and some of the key issues and challenges facing the Yazidi community. We'll have another 30 minutes or so of moderated conversation between the panelists before opening up to Q&A. For those of you joining us online, you're able to submit your questions throughout the event via Zoom, and I will check them after during the Q&A. And one final note before I hand over to Mirza. Today's event is being hosted by the XCEPT project, the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program, which is a multi-year research program funded by UK International Development. The team of XCEPT researchers at King's is focused on understanding more about the pathways to violent versus peaceful behavior, with the aim of informing policies and programs that can support a sustainable peace in conflict and post-conflict settings. And you can find out more about their work online. So, turning first to you, Mirza, we are 10 years on from an incredibly horrific and tragic event where 5,000 people were killed, up to 10,000 were taken captive or kidnapped, and around 500,000 Yazidis were displaced. Yazidis consider this to be the 74th genocide committed against them in their history, and 10 years on, can you maybe just start by telling us a little bit about what the situation is like for Yazidis in Iraq today?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much for the XCEPT and King's College for this invitation. It is my pleasure to be here, although the circumstances are not very satisfying. We know that the Yazidi situation, even after 10 years of the genocide, has not much changed. And if I go back as after 1948, the world and most of the states have signed a convention regarding prevention of genocide. But after that signature and ratification, a couple of genocide had happened. One of them, or last one, was the Yazidi genocide. So it's unfortunately to say that the world not only failed to stop genocide, to prevent genocide, but also failed the international community to heal the wounds and the injuries of each genocide since 1945 or 48. So, and therefore, we see a lot of hatred in the world. And if I go back to the Yazidi genocide and post-genocide issue, so just for you to know, Yazidi community is a small religious minority in the Middle East. It goes back around 5,000 years ago. Yazidi is a primitive monotheistic religion that is older than the Abrahamic religions, and but the Yazidis were all the time victims of different kind of massacre, persecution, non-acceptance. Yazidis were during the history also in the new Iraq after 1921, as Iraq became a republic, a monarchy, and after the republic, Yazid didn't have a real right in Iraq. They were just considered other citizens third degrees. The people were considered and also treated by Islamic law, as it was not an accepted religion. So if I go back after genocide and the horrific results of the genocide, that the whole community from Sinjar area was displaced in 2014. Till now, after 10 years, we have still more than 60% of the community in the tent and living displaced in KRI area, so in the Kurdistan regional area, and they cannot return back because of the political conflicts. Then, although 2017 ISIS was officially defeated and whole region, Yazidi region, has been liberated from ISIS, but we have now lack of administration because of political conflict inside Iraq, different political parties. So because of lack of administration, there are different militia groups who are ruling in the different area of Sinjar, and this political conflict between different parties inside Iraq are prohibiting also a kind of a process to go forward to the transitional justice, especially that Iraq unfortunately didn't establish a national agenda for transitional justice. So there is transitional justice in the term of the Iraqi government, just like a puzzle. They try to fill some areas, so and the other areas is completely neglected. For example, if you are speaking about the justice and the accountability, we see that there is a lack of law. Iraqi do not recognize until now. The Iraqi penal law is treating, and the court is treating with the crimes of ISIS just like a normal crime. So either they will be treated as an anti-terror law according to the anti-terror law, or according to the usual Iraqi penal code. That is not, there is no sense about that the international crime. This is the problem, that the Iraq didn't reform the law in that context. We don't have any court that is dealing with a genocide or crimes against humanity or the international crimes. This is the point. So if we are coming to the reparation, which is also one of the pillars of the or fact-finding commissions. We do not have any fact-finding commission. We do not have kind of recognition in that context. What Iraq did, which was a very important step that I have to find it a positive, that the Iraqi parliament established the Yazidi survival law, or the Yazidi women survival law, and which is one of the good steps from the whole puzzle of the transitional justice that has been in Iraq implemented. Although the implementation of the YSL is going very slow, but still the number of the victims who have until now took benefit from the reparation of the YSL is around 2,000. We know that the number of the Yazidi victims, especially women and children, there were 6,500. 2,000 of them are still missing. By the way, 2,600 of Yazidi women and children are still slaves in some places in Syria, in Al-Hol camp, in Idlib, where we know that the terrorist group who was ruling Idlib is now ruling the whole Syria after the fall of Assad regime. So this is the current situation. About 300,000 of the Yazidis are still displaced in Kurdistan region, and Iraqi government and the related authorities, Ministry of Migration and the related authorities who supposed to empower the local community, empower and facilitate the returning back of the people, although they put, for example, last year a deadline for closure of the camps, but they didn't have a realistic plan to close the camp. When they offered a minimum reparation of the people, but they do not receive their application for returning back. So we had, for example, in the summer, thousands of applications. The people wanted to leave the camp. So you can imagine 10 years, children who were 4 years old, they are now 14 years old. They do not find a house. They do not know what does a house means. So this is the current situation. I think I will put a few words in what's the responsibility. I started up that the international community failed to prevent, also failed to heal the injuries of the people. But still, I think it is so important to speak that the only solution for the Yazidi issues, also minority, non-Muslim minority issues, because of rising of all this fundamentalism and extremism in the region, that Sinjar supposed to be at least upgraded to a kind of autonomous region or a kind of a province within the Iraqi constitution, within the Iraqi law, and an international fund for rebuilding Sinjar is so important under the supervision of international community or UN or any countries in collaboration with Iraq. This is the only solution that you can bring the people back. You can also make a difference in the situation to keep the Yazidis in their country. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. That's a very helpful overview of sort of what we're looking at and dealing with in terms of the Yazidis today. I want to now turn online to Inna. I know you've done a lot of very interesting work about sort of competing victimhoods, historical injustices, and the role of memory. Could you maybe expand a little bit about your work in that field, especially as it relates to sort of justice 10 years on?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will try to keep it short. And a lot of the controversial points were already covered by my friend Mirza. I'm going to start with a rather disturbing story. We had the pleasure and honor nearly a year ago to visit Sinjar, including this amazing project, Mirza's House of Coexistence, Beit Ta'ayush al-Sununi, and to visit the holy shrines in Lalash. and also to attend a couple of cultural festivities in Ceyhan, hosted by prominent Yazidi elders. And I would never forget this quite generous dinner, the hospitality that we were able to witness there on the ground, and how disturbing it felt witnessing some of the Kurdish guests refusing to partake in the meal because of concerns of impurity regarding the Yazidi food. So this for me, of course, as an outsider, as a Western researcher, think tanker, academic, you keep reading these reports on the hate speech, on the stigmatization. But it's quite a different feeling when you're there and when you experience it. And the contrast is just so huge and so alarming. So on the one hand, you have all of these televised platforms on peaceful coexistence, reconciliation, the harmony within Iraq's diverse social fabric, like where you have tribal leaders, religious figures discussing like how much like their community appreciate each other and appreciate and want to work for this diversity. And then learning that at the end of the program, basically like everyone goes back to his own community, and skepticism and a lot of the prejudice and stereotyping persists. There have been many calls from Yazidi activists to take adequate action to tackle this inadequate, quite disturbing stereotyping and misinformation about the Yazidi religion and about the Yazidi culture. One of the suggestions that we've encountered quite often was, for example, revising the Iraqi curricula, working even more closely with Iraqi established religious leaders to shed more light on the Yazidi religion. And as we have learned, Yazidis have been victim to 72 genocides in history. And a lot of them date back to Ottoman Empire times, where there have been fatwas addressed at the Yazidi as devil worshippers, which of course legitimizes like their killing, assassination, the destruction of their property. Now, after the Iraqi constitution, after 2005, of course, like there is this veneer of religious rights, of equal, of adequate treating of Iraqi minorities. But still, we're talking here about the societal component of this marginalization, and this continues to persist. Now, I think Mirza gave a very detailed overview of all of these policies of more or less state-endorsed discrimination and equal treatment of the Yazidi communities. So of course, like this has been accompanied with a sense of alienation from the state, with a sense of mistrust, like whether and to which extent like this state is there to protect you and to guarantee your rights as an equal citizen. But what was then more disturbing, where the trust has really been shattered since the 2014, and this has a lot to do with the societal dynamics, and I want to touch on that because it's a very important point. Despite these feelings of alienation vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis like the formal establishments, there have been very deep societal relations, especially in Sinjar, between Yazidi communities and Arab tribes. One of the practices that I've been able to read upon, but also to learn in interviews with Yazidi counterparts, refers to the Abrahamic practice of circumcision, where Yazidi communities, Yazidi families would actually look to identify someone outside of their religion who is proclaimed a brother to the family. And the moment this bond is being completed, is being embraced by the Yazidi community, this person is considered sacred, and they're ready to do anything to protect this person. So you can imagine if this societal bond, like this very intimate bond, has existed between the Yazidi communities and the Arab tribes, what must have been the level of complete alienation, dismay of this betrayal, that exactly these neighbors, their friends, like the brothers of the families, were not the one to come and protect them. On the positive note, where a lot of work is now being done, which still promises results with a lot of low-hanging fruits, are dialogue formats that are locally led. They take very much place at the grassroots level, and that they are very carefully designed to avoid the re-traumatization of Yazidi victims. So for example, instead of like throwing the participants in these dialogue formats in a very controversial discussion about like who did what, groups are being brought together to discuss practical issues, to re-encounter each other again as humans, to be able to identify each other as as equal participants in this diverse environment. And some of the examples that I've witnessed is the change in the narrative, the change in the thinking. So for example, while at the beginning of some of these dialogue initiatives, some members from within the Yazidi community would be, of course, legitimately and quite understandably very skeptical, and would be saying, okay, but these Arab tribes were those who actually came and victimized our children, our wives, our families. The narrative, with time, has shifted to a more differentiated version of the truth, recognizing that a lot of the people who have ended up more or less under the banner of ISIS have been coerced, haven't really had the chance, haven't really participated jointly in all of the crimes in the genocide against the Yezidis, and more speaking about bad or controversial or rogue individuals who partook in these crimes against their community. So another another step like that Mirza also touched upon has been the Yazidi survival law, but there is still a lot of groundwork to be laid here in order for these laws to be perceived as something that goes beyond a cosmetic intervention. And this has a lot to do with implementation. The Coalition for Just Reparations has done brilliant mapping of the progress done on the implementation, and also on the framing of the law. And of course, there is still a lot of work to be done here, especially when it comes to help to be provided to victims of the Yazidi genocide, when it comes to PTSD, when it comes to reintegration, and when it comes also to equal access to compensation and to having the relevant paperwork. Another point that I wanted to raise here is, again, the perception of the controversial Sinjar agreement. We talked about the 3,000 displaced Yazidis for whom there is still no adequate resolution. Where are they going to be able to pursue a dignified livelihood that is not based on makeshift shelters? And I remember another controversial example, from one of my interviews when I was discussing with the Yazidi elder, the whole idea of watan, of a homeland. And we were talking, of course, about the demographics in the camps. And he said, for a lot of these young kids who have only seen the camp is al-watan, the camp is the homeland. So how do you want to reintegrate them in societies? What kind of mechanisms are there being discussed, to help them connect to these communities? And another, I think, point that is not sufficiently being discussed, both at the policy level, but also at the level of international discussions with donor organizations, is also preparatory work with host communities. So we can talk a lot about what we can do and how we are going to approach the displaced individuals, but this is not going to work well if there are no sufficient mechanisms to prepare the soil for the host community, to know what kind of traumatized demographics are going to enter this community, and how are they best to engage with them. Last point, I'm not sure how many minutes I have left.
Good. You've got about 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. Yeah, perfect. So we talked about this sense of alienation and mistrust when it comes to top-down interventions to resolving some of the Yazidi grievances. Logically and also disturbingly so, the more distrust is being shattered, the more tangible examples there are that Yazidi can indeed rely on a functioning judiciary system, to provide them with a sense of justice, with a sense of also emotional and psychological and social compensation, for whatever they have gone through, but also to provide them like with workable solutions when it comes to paperwork, when it comes to inheritance issues, like when it comes to managing, acquiring property, like all of these aspects. The less the state and the formal institutions are your logical counterpart, the more vulnerable you are to be open to other modes of cooperation or engagement with armed paramilitary actors or non-state actors or parastate actors. And then everyone with those communities is more likely to look for the best possible and reliable patron that can guarantee an access to patronage networks, that can guarantee a certain level of security, that can help out when it comes like to the provision of services, to the resolution of administrative problems. And what a lot of the Yazidi counterparts that I've been discussing with are now really disturbed about is that with Yazidis not having felt sufficiently consulted in the implementation, in the conceptualization to begin with, then implementation and like the lack of reconfiguration of the so-called Sinjar agreement, the more this illicit form of engagements are going to grow, and like the more Yazidi communities caught more or less in the crossfire between Iranian-backed, Kurdish-backed, etc., different paramilitary actors in this environment, are going to have to constantly reevaluate like their bet of like the most convenient, the most reliable ally. And especially against this background, against sufficient, adequate interventions from the international community to guarantee a level of security to actually enable those who want to return to Sinjar because of a sense of patriotism, because of a sense of connectedness to the land that's very deeply entrenched in Yazidi psychology. Like, I mean, the more this skepticism and criticism vis-a-vis calls from European governments to actually, on the one hand, like rejecting asylum seekers, and on the other hand, appealing like to Yazidi migrants, like to go back to their territories, the more this is going to be associated with hypocrisy. And on this rather pessimistic note, I would end here and hand over to Alannah.
Thank you so much, Inna. That's a very helpful summary. And I think actually you made a perfect segue over to Alannah by talking about, the extent to which Yazidis feel that they can actually rely on the judiciary as a source of justice. So maybe with that, I will hand it over to Alannah to talk a little bit more about what sorts of justice mechanisms have been tried, how successful they have or haven't been.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. And also thank you for having me today. And Beth is very kindly going to share some links to longer pieces. So please feel free to check them out. I've actually written a journal article on this, which will be published next week. So I'm going to sort of go through it quickly. And the other two pieces are one's on the UN humanitarian transition in Iraq, which Mirza touched on the context, but I think that shows more from the policy perspective why that's happening. The UN is, well, it was already shifted. It's development focused now rather than supporting the camps. And yeah, just to tie into that also, we've seen UNITAD close, UNAMI, the UN's political mission in Iraq is due to close by the end of next year. And, the international community, I hate that phrase, but by and large, funding, political interest is dwindling. And, we've seen recently the UK's focus has been on a border deal with the Kurdistan region. So they're very much trying to stop people getting out rather than supporting the actual reasons why so many want to leave the region. So to start with, I'm going to give a quick overview of the UNITAD mission, which ended 3 months ago on the 17th of September. Obviously, there's been a lot of disappointment and criticism, I would say very rightly so, in this flawed and failed mission, which resulted in just 9 international prosecutions for crimes against humanity and genocide. The best part of $20 million budget per year. And so now mostly this evidence is in the basement of the UN in New York. it's totally inaccessible. There are big questions over where survivors' witness statements are. And the responsibility, like so many things in Iraq, now rests with the Iraqi authorities. And obviously that's problematic for many reasons. As Mirza was saying, there's a difference between the KRG and the federal Iraqi authorities in terms of jurisdiction over particular areas, but also the camps that are still open in the Kurdistan region exist because the Kurdistan region will let them stay open. And the Iraqi government maintains its decision that it wants to close them. Whether it will or not remains to be seen, but certainly has pulled the funding. So yeah, UNITAD, I mean, I would again just suggest if you're watching online, you can read my longer article on this. But part of the reason for its closure was its complete inability to work effectively with Iraq. And so essentially what we saw, it was established UN Resolution 2379 in 2017 to document, collect evidence of ISIL crimes in Iraq, to exhume mass graves and to support, theoretically, to support prosecutions and international jurisdiction in third-party states. But it didn't, it never managed to find a way to support prosecutions within Iraq because of issues with sharing evidence that would potentially result in the death penalty, which of course Iraq maintains, and it has a right to. So basically, the system was quite flawed from the beginning, and massively raised expectations, and now there is a big hole in terms of what will follow. I personally strongly believe that CSOs, Yazidi activists, communities really need to engage with the Iraqi authorities. There hasn't, for many reasons, been a direct engagement between many of the NGOs working on the ground with survivors, collecting evidence, to actually engage with federal justices about being involved in prosecutions, and that's a massive shame. Just for some context, in Baghdad at the moment, they've established the national kind of center, which will continue, theoretically continue the work of UNITAD in terms of, I mean, various things. It'll be like a museum, an archive, but also will continue the work of prosecutions. And so there is a need for engagement rather than looking outwards all the time at international communities, NGOs, need to actually, I believe, engage with structures in the country, because although survivors, repeatedly talk about how they want the crimes that were committed against them to be prosecuted in Iraq under legislation such as genocide, Iraq doesn't have that on its statute book, and it's not likely to have that. And so there is this gap between what we would like to see and what is the reality. And I think that can be quite frustrating, and I think is why we often go round and round in circles, and nothing really changes, sadly. Of course, I can say this because I'm emotionally not directly involved anymore, but it's a hugely emotive issue. Okay, so on the other hand, obviously we were talking there about why there are issues with Iraq's prosecutions of ISIL fighters. They have been over the last several years prosecuting ISIL fighters in Iraq. That hasn't been engagement with survivors. That's been part of the problem, that these systems, UNITAD and the Iraqi judiciary and the KRG judiciary as well, obviously has been operating separately, hasn't really been, well, they weren't working together. And so we have this situation where actually probably most, or by and large, the majority of majorly young men who were involved in members of ISIS or accused of being involved with ISIS have already been prosecuted, and they're going down this other track, essentially, being warehoused and increasingly executed. And so it's hard to see how these two systems would ever have worked well together, but that gives you some context as to why they haven't. And it kind of does link to the UN humanitarian transition in the sense that attention, funding, engagement has shifted. I mentioned UNAMI is set to leave by the end of next year, UNITAD's closed, and the UN is not directly involved in the provision of any of the remaining 23 IDP camps. So again, responsibility here rests very much with Iraqi authorities. And just to clarify, there are 160,000 IDPs still living in tents and camps in the Kurdistan region, and about 300,000 in total displaced. So some of those are just in I say just, but they are in protracted displacement. Okay. I hope that was explained. I can go into more detail in the Q&A about UNITAD specifically and about what went so terribly wrong there. But it's this whole concept of imposing a Western framework on a country that A, isn't, maybe equipped or doesn't operate in that way. But B, you then have this situation which is really frustrating, where you basically have a silo of communities not working together, and so no change is made. Mirza touched and Inna touched on the 2021 Yezidi Survivors Law. That's often used to show there has been progress, and there has been progress in the sense that there are women receiving reparations, and there is a framework in there for engagement on justice issues, but things that really still do need to be prioritized. And we hear this from survivor communities themselves. And one of the reports, hopefully Beth will share, is a piece of work C4JR, the Coalition for Just Reparations, published in August, which is based on consultations with survivor communities themselves, 10 key demands, 10 years on. And the section on justice and accountability, does talk about, of course, wanting to see prosecutions, but that also then requires other structural changes, such as witness protection. There was a witness protection law, 58, 2017, that still really needs to be implemented for survivors to feel comfortable in coming forward with issues. Psychosocial support, education, obviously, these are hugely critical parts of the YSL framework, which, progress is being made on, but there's ultimately still just massive deficiencies. That's my 10 minutes, but can I just very quickly, sorry, I'm sort of chopped and changed, but I guess what I really want to stress in all of this, and it kind of links to what the future holds, is that basically these Yezidi NGOs have done amazing work, and Shabak and Christian and Tuckman and others, and Spiker NGO and organizations of survivors. And it can feel like that's slipping away as international involvement goes, but actually it's a really key moment, I think, to engage with authorities in the country, because that is the only way that anything is ever going to happen. And at the moment, they are still operating in silos. And that also makes sense when you consider that there's a huge lack of jobs in these communities. Many NGOs are the means of employment, and yeah, that can be a tension also. And also, I guess we'll probably cover it in the Q&A, but just as we look also across the border at Syria, there are huge fears in these minority communities, but there are also potential opportunities that can be really harnessed when we think of, access to parts of Syria that may hold missing women, and potential opportunities for further accountability. And then also one more thing, which I hope to discuss more in the Q&A, but Mirza mentioned the missing 2,600 figure. We talk about that a lot. There are also many children growing up in Syrian orphanages who are unable to be reunited with their communities for various reasons, and it's an issue that really does need to be addressed, because they're reaching 10, 11, 8, 9, 10 years old, and they deserve to have a future too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alannah. Very helpful overview of kind of where we stand with domestic and international justice. Maybe on that, I want to take it back to you, Mirza, to pull out some of the points that Alannah talked about. She mentioned some of the challenges that Yazidis faced dealing with the Iraqi judiciary itself. And from what I've seen, a lot of those challenges have resulted, as Alannah said, in Yazidi organizations looking much more towards the international community, looking towards UN mechanisms like UNITAD, like prosecutions in third states, such as Germany, to seek justice. Could you talk a little bit more about what that process has been like, trying to engage with Iraqi courts, and sort of where the challenges have been, and if you see any opportunities moving forward to make more space for that kind of work?
Well, the biggest problem that Yazidis actually, they do not have a real influence on the Iraqi politics. So, for example, in the parliament, we have just one quota seat. Although in 2010 I filed a case against the Iraqi parliament and asked for 5 seats as quota. And I won the case in the federal court, but the parliament didn't implement. Although the decisions of the federal court are actually obligatory for the Iraq, but the Iraqi parliament ignored our file until today. So from 2010 until today. So we do not have a political, let's say, political value or power in Iraq, so we cannot change a lot. The second thing that we know that within the Iraqi political context and decision making, there are a lot of controversial conflicts within different political parties, different parliamentarian blocs. A lot of problem also regarding corruption, regarding different deals that are not reliable with the Iraqi constitution, with the human rights standards. So all these affect the implementation of justice in whole Iraq, to be honest. So Iraq is very new in the democratic game. And for that reason, we cannot change a lot. So lobbying for us as Yazidi activists, Yazidi NGOs inside Iraq is somehow not possible. This is different. Generally, working with the public policies in Iraq is not that easy for civil society. So it is because civil society is really new in whole Iraq. And we know the clashback of the civil society after the October demonstration in Iraq in 2020. So that's why most of the Yazidi activists or Yazidi NGOs, we were concentrating and relying on the engagement, solidarity from international community to find a path through diplomatic mission, how to communicate with Iraq in order to change something. I think the most of the positive steps that has been taken in Iraq regarding Yazidis, minority issues, or generally human rights issues, is through this kind of communication with the international community. On the local level, we know, for example, until today, we do not have any Yazidi judge because Yazidis were prohibited to become a judge because Yazidi are seen, so at least according to the Sharia, as infidel. So you cannot be a judge because judge is one who is, let's say, the godfather of the community, and an infidel one cannot be a judge, for example. Although the Iraqi law changed, so Iraqi constitution is recognizing Yazidis now, but we do not have judges. So you can imagine that the whole judiciary system in Iraq is not working that well that we expect. So in different points. So I would like just to name an example. Maybe it's an exemption, but just for you to know, because I was personally engaged. One of the Yazidi women survivor that I brought to Germany was a victim of one of Daesh fighters. And this Daesh fighter was imprisoned and tried in one of the Iraqi court. And this witness and victim gave her witnesses. She was in Germany, although she was very afraid if she tell the court that the perpetrator who sexually abused her and enslaved her, maybe he will take revenge in the future. But nevertheless, we convinced her that the Iraq is working, the new Iraq is working, the court is going to protect her, and she's in Germany anyway. So I convinced her to give her testimony before the court. She gave the testimony. The court punished this guy with the anti-terror law, and he complied before the upper court. And because he was a cousin of one of the Iraqi governors and an influential one, so after a couple of months in the prison, the trial was repeated, and according to the Iraqi law, they should give the witness 1 month to come, and the judge invited the witness in Germany and sent her a letter 1 week after the decision and gave her 3 days. So which means, so she's supposed to come 4 days ago. And as the witness was not there, she's not able to go there. As she was not there, he become then free. And they said it is not a lack of evidences, and he become free. And now he is free running. So for that reason, it is even very difficult to implement justice. And the impunity is, unfortunately, is one of the points that we are afraid of. And last point that I would like to mention, and now really there is a part of negotiation between Shia and Sunni group, the general amnesty law that is has been ratified now by the Iraqi parliament. So this is the situation we are living in.
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging story to hear. I can only imagine what it must have been like for this woman to live it. And maybe just to provide a little bit of context for the audience, as Alannah said, there is no law in Iraq that explicitly criminalizes war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. So in the years following 2017, the vast majority of people, and we're talking thousands of people, were wrapped up, tried on mainly the crime of affiliation to a terrorist group under the counterterrorism law. Yeah. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of people that have been imprisoned because they were members of ISIS. And of course, if you're somebody whose father was murdered by them, if you were somebody who was kidnapped by them, you want to see them go to jail for murder. You want to see them go to jail for enslaving you, not because they kidnapped you. Yeah. And at the same time, we saw cases where people were sentenced to death after 5-minute trials without a lawyer present, based on one confession extracted under torture. And maybe, Inna, I want to turn to you to hear some of your thoughts about this, because from my experience, it's created quite a lot of distrust, particularly among Sunni Arab men who were the primary group targeted by this. And that's been sort of one of these community level, individual level barriers towards reconciliation. You talked about some of these initiatives, the interfaith dialogue and these kinds of things. Have you seen any success from them? And what are the sort of barriers that you're seeing outside of the Yazidi community that make achieving justice more difficult?
So, in the beginning of the talk, I was addressing the issue of competing victimhoods. Of course, on the one hand, you have this deeply entrenched frustration from within the Yazidi community because of a lack of a holistic, comprehensive, not apology, but in a sense recognition. Why have we allowed certain exploitation of Islamic narratives, by extremists, by terrorist groups, to victimize this whole community? On the other hand, from as we were talking, like from Sunni Arab men, like of course there is also a sense of disenchantment, like when it comes like to this holistic, uncritical scapegoating of the whole Sunni Arab like community as somehow like responsible for whatever like crimes ISIS perpetrated. Now, where I have seen some positive steps, interestingly, like what sometimes has served as a social glue or repairing the gap, the vacuum like between these two victimhoods, is basically when they encounter each other and when they both learn how much both have suffered on the one hand, like from the hands of ISIS, and on the other hand, have been either prejudiced against or neglected and have been disserviced in a sense, like by the Iraqi judiciary, and have not been able to obtain justice. Some of these encounters have been happening organically. We tried to cover a couple of them. For instance, there are some brilliant initiatives going on in Mosul in the field of heritage reconstruction. The Heritage House in Mosul in particular, the Beitna Foundation, even activities like from Mosul University, like have started gathering indeed, like both victims, like from Yezidi communities, but also like Sunni Arab that were forced to live under ISIS rule. And the more like they encounter each other under such organic circumstance, the more they're able like to talk about their respective victimhood, about like their respective like sacrifices and injustices that they have suffered through under ISIS. I mean, on the other hand, I remember this emotional encounter by a representative of a Sunni Arab community from Mosul, like who was very emotionally like calling for identifying the DNA of the corpses found in the morgue, just like to prove, like to show to the world that Sunni Arabs have been severely attacked and victimized by ISIS during its rule over Mosul. And I think like the more this respective traumatic experiences like come to light and are also understood, digested by the respective community, like the better chance we have to tackle like this sometimes controversial meta perceptions. See, like this group would always see me as the perpetrator, or like this group would always think of me as someone like who has enabled, who has cheered, who has somehow not protested enough, not resisted enough against like this terrorist regime. We've also encountered some displaced Sunni Arab tribes from Sinjar that were in Mosul and that were sharing that they really want to return, but again, like because of misinformation, because of prejudice, because of stereotyping, they were saying that they have fear from retaliation from Yezidi community, because they were thinking if like all of this has been inflicted onto them, like all of this trauma and suffering, what will happen to us like if we go back? So in that sense, I think again, like very much grassroots, like locally rooted initiatives, projects, places of encounter, like the House of Coexistence of Mirza, like all of those heritage initiatives in Mosul are really a superb example, like how victims of these different communities like can come together and somehow organically enter into a conversation that would allow them to jointly digest what has happened to them without necessarily victimizing each other or without necessarily putting each other into like this very binary categories of a victim and perpetrator. And I mean, now before the talk, Mirza and I were discussing, and he was sharing with me a very important visit, like from Shamari tribe to the House of Coexistence. And I think like such gestures are far beyond the cosmetic level. Like they are very important. They have a very important symbolic meaning. If a stakeholder, if an important actor, like from within the Iraqi like tribal landscape, such as Shamari tribe, go and engage in such a constructive visit, engage in an eye-level conversation with Yazidi communities, that's very important, and might in an ideal scenario, leads to more resistance to the very heightened hate speech like that has been extremely alarming to a lot of Yazidis, and particularly not just the discriminatory statements of certain radical preachers online, but the lack of reaction, the lack of protest, the lack of outrage that this is happening, and that despite of the atrocities, and I mean the trauma, like the shock that all of the different communities, of course, like experienced with ISIS and during this very dark period, that this hasn't, in a sense, vaccinated communities enough, like to react preemptively to such alarming signals, such as, yeah, the recently occurring hate speech against Yazidi communities.
I mean, it's interesting because as I listen to the two of you talk, it sounds like there's a lot of progress happening and a lot of potential on the individual community level. There's also been some steps at the international level, and it leaves me wondering where that middle level of the Iraqi state is. Maybe as well, just because you brought it up in your remarks, I'll finish with one last question to Alannah before opening it more broadly. And that is about Syria, of course. I mean, on Sunday, if you haven't heard by now, I'm very pleased to be the one to tell you that Bashar al-Assad has fallen.
Finally.
It is, obviously a moment of jubilation and hope and opportunity for so many Syrians who've suffered. But it's also a moment of anxiety and fear for the many minority groups within Syria, including the Yazidis. As you mentioned, there's still thousands of Yazidis that are being held captive, whose fates are unknown, many of whom we assume are in Syria. So maybe, Alannah, if you have any last reflections you want to share on what this moment means with Iraq as the island of stability and for once.
Well, and also I was talking to Mirza too before we started about this, and it's important to acknowledge there are lots of fears within the Yazidi community and other minority communities in Iraq, because of course there are similarities between HTS or former members who were involved in ISIS, and so not to at all not appreciate those fears. But I guess a message to Syrian human rights activists based on our experience in Iraq would be start now, start collecting your evidence now. Do not get swayed by UN bodies that sell you the world, because it has to be grounded in your country, your jurisdiction. I mean, I even was speaking to someone this morning who was saying, if only Syria joined the ICC, then that would be a way to get Assad that way. And I think, these international frameworks that just get imposed on countries, UNITAD shows that just doesn't work. And it more than that, it really lets people down. I don't know if we adequately conveyed in our talk how disappointed, frustrated communities feel. And then obviously, at the UN Security Council or whatever, the UK mission, which was the penholder of UNITAD, just moves on. And actually it's quite disgraceful. There really should be an inquiry. But I forgot to mention, and it ties a bit to that yeah, continuing to push for Western legal concepts just totally demonstrates a failure to understand the reality of the situation. And also is holding back change, I think, from within the country, that so many members of the international community purport to support. But yeah, going back to Syria, obviously, we know that, and Amnesty International, who are in the room also, have done great work reporting on the women and children in Al-Hol camp. There are Yazidis in Syria that need to be returned if they want to return. There is an opportunity there to really engage with whoever, whatever this new Syria will be. I mentioned in my talk the issue of orphans born of rape who are still in Syria. Obviously, there's a tension there. There are, and I've spoken to Yazidi women who returned against their will and left their children there. And so, of course, sometimes these repatriations are not as ethical as you might think. So I mean, just not to end on a downer, but obviously it should be up to the women as well, what they want to do. there was one thing that you guys were talking about that I wanted to jump in on as well. I think it was when we were talking about engaging with the Iraqi judiciary, and the fact that, you know, I didn't mean at all to say that everything is perfect. We know that there are terrible, I mean, the UN Special Rapporteurs in June this year basically said that the government of Iraq's systematic execution of prisoners amounts to arbitrary deprivation of life under international law, and it's seemingly executions continue to surge. So all is not rosy with the Iraqi judiciary. I guess I just meant to stress the point that that is probably the only way to affect change. And it's a shame that it took 10 years for people to get to that stage of understanding. I cannot stress enough how flawed and deeply failed the Unitide project has been. But yeah, so yeah, I guess to reconnect to your point on Syria, you know, the triple IM, that could be a mechanism, but also please ground it in your communities. I don't know, yeah, does that cover it? Essentially, I hope, like everyone, that minorities will be protected in Syria.
Don't we all? Did you want to come in on the Syria question?
Well, I was 5 minutes ago before the session, I was discussing the issue with my friend Ghaib. Yeah, so generally I'm skeptic about what's going on in Syria. So I was one of the criticals of the Assad regime, and I was so happy that the Assad regime was being defeated, and at least it's gone, and the people of Syria will enjoy the freedom. But the groups that who are ruling is so I cannot rely on them, because some of them are actually on the they had power in Idlib, and they are real terrorists. The slavery was still, we know the situation of some Yazidi slaves in Idlib. And because Syria is actually a multinational diversity country, even the diversity image in Syria broader than Iraq as well. And I hope that the different Syrian groups, different communities, the Arab, the Kurds, the Alawite, the Druze, the Christian, they will enjoy the freedom, and there will be a kind of power sharing for whole Syria. The other concerning factor, so we know that there is or there are some regional countries who were engaged in defeating Assad regime. So what is their agenda? Are they really, do they really believe in freedom and democracy in Syria, or they just wanted to implement their own plan? This is what's concerning me, to be honest. So I think this is the next construction point that international community should be really aware on it, and I hope that the new American administration is not say enough with Syria. We are going to go back and leave Syria for its destiny. This will be a disaster.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we've covered quite a range of things, from reconciliation, justice, camp closures, Syria. So I'm opening the floor now to Q&A. I'll take a couple questions and then give the panelists a chance to respond. I'll check online. Thank you. Raz.
Hi, I'm Raz, the Iraq researcher at Amnesty International. Thank you so much for this event. It's so important. At the same time, it's really sad to hear that nothing has changed. So I have a question for Mirza. If I may share an anecdote of my research, I had the privilege of documenting the case of many Yazidi women who, I don't want to say, who fled. They had very little help to leave slavery, to leave sexual enslavement. And one of the last interviews I did was with a woman who had been in captivity for several years with her children. And I'm going to use her words. She was sold as a package with her children, not separately, because they would be either separated or sold as a package, so with 3 of her children. And the beating of her children was used as a punishment for her lack of compliance. And she was sold several times before she was helped by her relatives who borrowed money from others to help her escape. Zero help from any government sides. But what really stuck with me, of course, all of that stuck with me, but what really stuck with me was her main concern was to find the money to travel into Duhok to follow up with civil status documentation. Not to get psychosocial care, not to get sexual health care, not to go to weekly group therapy. When I asked her, she just smiled at me, and I felt very stupid, obviously. That was 5 years ago, that interview. From what I'm hearing from you and from our work of monitoring, very little has changed. So my question is to Mirza, how much has changed for the individual woman today? And how much of that can we put blame on the international community, who in that woman's words was, all they have for us are tears and stupid workshops.
Mhm.
And forgive me for my very amnesty honesty.
Yes, thank you.
There's another question in the room. We'll take maybe one from the room and there's one in the chat. I'll take the one from the chat while you think of your question. Could the speakers please explain why there is this lack of interest in missing Yazidis? 10 years on, they are still unaccounted for, and I believe the longer they stay under captivity, assuming most are alive, the more likely they would be re-victimized in different ways.
Should we take those?
We'll go for it.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, do you want to address Raz's question first?
Okay. Well, unfortunately, the answer is not satisfying. The situation has not changed very well. I was engaged in 2015 in the resettlement project of the women to Germany. We have resettled 1,100 women and children to Germany. I was helping them also by making the civil documents. At that time, it was easier than now. At least we had all, because they were all alternative offices around Duhok. So it was easy to catch those alternative offices, because Mosul was under the occupation of ISIS, to issue these documents very easily. After the liberation of Sinjar and Mosul, so some offices returned back to Sinjar, some offices returned back to Mosul. Administration didn't return back to Sinjar. So someone who need to issue its, for example, ID, has to visit different offices in Sinjar and Mosul and Duhok and come back and to take a lot of money and a lot of time, and nobody's supporting that. So by implementing, if the implementation, the reparation process of the YSL goes well, although there is a lack of funding in that, but at least they will get some kind of monthly monthly reparation or monthly salary that they can cover that. But unfortunately, is not better than the before. Who's responsible of that? Well, state, for my understanding, state is responsible. If you run after your ID several weeks because the state failed to issue your ID within 2 days. This is the process. And we know also the bureaucracy in Iraq is not the best. And so sometime you need for a document to 5 signatures from different offices until you issue a document. So it is not a problem of the Yazidis, the problem in whole Iraq. Yeah.
Can I get the question on missing Yazidis? It's a very good question. I think we've all wondered it. I mean, one of the arguments as to why it's been so difficult has been access to certain parts of Syria, fears of, lots of ISIS fighters still in Turkey with these missing women and children. Recently, it's a slow kind of, not a trickle, I'm trying to think of another phrase. Occasionally, we'll see stories in the news of women being returned, whether they're found in parts of Syria or in even Gaza. So yeah, the question is correct. There are certainly missing people still, whether it's 2,600, I think is sadly unlikely, but certainly in the hundreds. There are theoretical frameworks that are, in the Kurdistan region, you have the Department for Missing Yezidis. They have a responsibility for these, to find these individuals. I can't speak authoritatively, but clearly they're not really doing that much, essentially. I think individuals, like Mirza and the beekeeper of Sinjar, and that there have been in individual attempts to track these women down. Often it's the families themselves are doing the majority of the work, and it's these kind of informal frameworks that result in the most success, to be honest. I guess it comes back to why Yezidis are still displaced, why Sinjar hasn't been rebuilt, why, it's the lack of political weight that the communities carry. And maybe people who kind of care or want to help have absolutely nothing to offer, in the sense that we're not part of those communities or networks who are doing the majority of the work. Like, just to give an example, when I was like 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, met a woman who'd recently returned in Hangi, and she was, obviously it was actually a very sad story, but kind of while I was there and after, dozens and dozens of other members of her community came and were asking her about, did you see this person, or did you come across? And so this is actually by and large how I think women are actually found. It's through networks, people who are returned, and they can piece together, if you saw my younger brother then he must still be alive, or my mother, or whatever. Obviously, I'm not saying that's a better system. I think it's absolutely not, but I think it's just another example of where so much of the international involvement has totally failed. And, UNITAD also, such a missed opportunity to address any of these issues. And just to add that also in our C4JR report, something that came up time and time and time again in all of the consultations is the connection between a realization of justice to a sense of faith in the prevention of similar atrocities. And that also includes finding out what happened to missing relatives.
I think also, in addition to it being challenging on the practical level, it's also a kind of activity that exposes people to a lot of risk. Oftentimes kidnapped women, they're still being held by their captors, and to be released, they demand ransom payments, which means that the person paying the ransom exposes themselves to prosecution because they're financing a terrorist organization. Obviously, I think we would all agree that it's a very worthy cause, and we can have debates about the ethics of whether or not you should pay the ransom. But it does expose people to a lot of personal risk. And then on the flip side, it has been 10 years. A lot of these women, they became pregnant by rape. They have children now. They can't return with their children. The children have grown up believing, if they were abducted as children, maybe they were 1, 2, 3 years old, they've been living the last 10 years believing that, these two people are their parents, and to suddenly come home at 12 years old, 13, 14, 15 years old to a community where maybe you've forgotten Kurdish, you don't know that your true mother and father are actually your mother and father. It's an incredibly traumatizing, difficult thing for people to have to go through. So, there's so many different layers that need to be considered when doing this. It's really not just a question of, we're going to do some investigations, find them, rescue them, take them home, and it's all rainbows and sunshine. It's really much more fraught and requires a lot of attention to, individual circumstances and their trauma.
Can I say one quick thing? I do wonder if with changes in Syria, obviously it's still to be seen what will happen in the north east, but we could potentially be seeing the closure of Al-Hol and Jeddah. I don't think that's implausible. Other things have happened in Syria in recent days. And with that, almost certainly there will be Yazidi women and children to be repatriated and supported. And so that's probably something to keep eyes and attention on for people who care about trying to find these missing, although we do know that they are in these camps, so how missing they are, is debatable.
The problem is the accessibility to these camps is not easy. So from NES, for example, Al-Hol camp, so the different authorities from NES, they cannot access all the part of the camp. From experience and the women who came back or children who came back from the captivity in the past few years, most of them, when they come back, they even don't know that Yazidis are still existing. So ISIS brainwashed them and told them, we have killed all the Yazidis, your parents, and all of them are converted to Islam. You don't need to go to Sinjar. And so they forget. We have also a lot of children who even do not remember where they are coming from. So it is just like a lack of institutional framework for that, lack of experience in this, and also you cannot access most of the places where those children and women, let's say, so these 2,600 who are still missing, most of them are minors, so they are, or they were in 2014 minors, so they are not adult. Most of them forgot their origin.
Is there any analysis of that is published?
Yeah, a lot of it.
A lot. And hopefully, well, I guess you're not in the chat, but there are, we publish articles, a massive report even this year, which has all of the data and information from survivor communities.
They're also from the so there are out of researches published from the political point of view and also from the psychological point of view. For example, we have Professor Jan Kizilhan, one of the most famous professor in the psychology, who published a lot of researches regarding the trauma healing, and also all situation of the Yazidi women and children who experience this period of slavery, and there are a lot of research regarding that point.
Inna, I want to bring you in here. There's a question for you in the chat, and then maybe we'll take the last round of questions from the room and then wrap up. What is the role of community leaders between the communities? The concept of meta-perceptions and prejudice is very interesting here. Are leaders able to act as ambassadors within Iraqi structures, a bit like the grassroots initiatives you mentioned? So this one is for you, Inna, and then if there's other questions in the room.
Yeah. I think communal leaders in the Iraqi context are extremely important. There's been a lot of, preoccupation with Weberian ideas of the state and monopoly on the use of force. I think like where Weber is more representative for the Iraqi context is when we speak about the importance of traditional and charismatic authority. And in that sense, religious, local, tribal leaders have an enormous role to play. For example, a lot of tribal leaders like that we've been able to interview see themselves, and rightly so, this is actually like something commendable, as someone who is also responsible to inform the host communities of like who is going to come back. They take their responsibility very seriously, especially like with this whole controversial and very laden topic of returnees, of ISIS families, of ISIS children. They are aware of the level of stigmatization, and they are trying like to reach out, rightly so, to host communities, to those who are going to coexist with whoever is returning, to be prepared, to be sufficiently informed about the level of trauma that these individuals have experienced. So this is extremely important. Now, having said that, there is another problem, and this is the so-called romanticization of everything that's tribal, local, grassroots, community-led. Now we shouldn't also idealize the concept too much or expect like the impossible out of it. To give you an example, like we are dealing here with individuals that are dynamic, with power structures that are also agile, that have a huge component of a learning curve embedded within them. So for example, let's say like that on the good side, stakeholders in the field of reconciliation and peace building have learned about the importance of engaging with tribal, communal, local actors for, let's say, repairing trust, bringing communities together, contributing to social cohesion. Less constructive actors would also, at least by that time, be sufficiently informed and aware of the importance of these actors. So there is also the aspect of co-optation, of contestation of these like very important actors, and like trying to attract them to different sides and also to instrumentalize them. And of course, in a setting where we talked about, there is still like a lot of skepticism of how much is to be expected from the state, from the state's formal institution, like from the so-called bureaucratic field. I mean, these actors, these entrepreneurs are sometimes vulnerable to go with one side or the other, to go with the side like promising them on the one hand, like more exposure, more security, more influence. And we've seen this a lot, like in the case of the role of tribal leaders. There's been one actually excellent report on tribal justice mechanisms and the way like the state has tried to deal with this shake. So interestingly, I mean, both state actors, paramilitary actors have been very diligent in learning the details, the granularity of the local context of tribal dynamics. And for example, like if there is more or less known information or available information about contestation, about power rivalries within a certain tribe, like then it's very easy like to try to approach like one or the other actor, the one trying to stay in power or the one like trying to achieve like better gains for himself and for his clan, and to somehow co-opt them or to win them for their case. And that's why like there's been also a bit like this derogatory term of shuyukh ad-dawla, or the sheikhs of the state, like those who have been, let's say, more open to collaboration like with state actors, like both for constructive and less constructive purposes. So of course there's been a lot of excellent evidence-based research published on the topic. I do agree, like having come from the field in Iraq, having witnessed the outreach, the entrenchment of these actors, like you can't bypass them. They're extremely important. But there is sometimes this misconception in the way like sometimes international donor organizations or international aid actors work, and like driven by this idea to work with the tribes, to engage the tribes, they sometimes start treating them more or less as like highly paid fixers, but not necessarily taking them seriously as someone like who has the right, who feels entitled to co-shaping the whole process. And I think it's much more like to be gained if one changes its approach towards these actors, to involve them at the early stage, like to have more participatory approaches to implementing projects on the ground, engaging with communities, rather than like often this very bureaucratic idea, okay, like this is the budget, like this is the gatekeeper that I want to convince or to win over for my side, and I come to him with a proposal with a list of services or contacts that I need for my project or certain initiatives that I want to implement, instead of like having like this very, you know, organic, almost like nuclear conversation, listen, like what's happening within this fabric and what kind of intervention has been tested, where have there been like trial and error, and like how should we approach this in the first place. So yeah, this would be my advice, like to involve them more like in the conceptualization of initiatives, like, and not just as highly or less highly paid implementers.
So we are at time. I want to free those that wish to be freed, but I know we have 2 questions left. So I will say my last piece, which is that assistants will be handing out reflection cards, and we would be very grateful if everyone could share their thoughts. Those of you that are interested in staying on maybe 5 minutes more just to take the last 2 questions, please stay. Those of you that have other commitments, thank you for joining the event. So there was a question here.
Hi, my name is Mercedes. I completely agree. I'm studying my master's now, but I've spent 20 years in the defense industry, got a bachelor's in psychology, and I completely agree. I've been in Jordan for 7.5 years. The cultural unawareness that the UN, NATO, and a lot of these bodies have had when going into operate into places like that is unbelievable. They just really don't know how the local cultures work and how to respect the tribal leaders, giving them the respect that they need and letting them have the agency, because you know, if you bring them on board, they will be able to motivate their people. There's a lot that they don't understand, and a lot of people sitting behind shiny desks. So I guess that's just one comment I wanted to, but I guess my question is, you're saying that obviously a lot of the work needs to happen in Iraq, that the laws in Iraq need to change. I also understand about wasta, vitamin wow, in the Middle East and the corruption that is out there. What can the international community do to pressure? What can they do to pressure Iraq to make changes? And is there anything else that they can do other than pressuring Iraq?
Yeah.
Maybe, sorry, just before you answer, we'll get the last question in case there's
okay.
overlap, and then just for the people online.
A
Thanks.
short question. The answer might have to be a book, but can you make any quick comments about teaching in schools in Iraq, both in the Sunni and the Shia communities, regarding Yazidis and other minorities? What's the general picture? And also the same question for what is preached in mosques.
Great question.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to answer very shortly. So from my perspective, international community can do a lot. Besides this diplomatic communication, we will not say pressure, diplomatic communication with Iraq. I think international community also can, for example, although we are far away from that, but Security Council, for example, can make some resolutions regarding the post-genocide effect of the Yezidi. So this is the one of the point. I think for rebuilding Sinjar, rebuilding trust, there should be an international fund that can support the community. And even this fund can be also with the half of contribution of Iraq. We know, for example, in America, Savage has been punished with some penalty. They can put some fund for that even not from the country. So there are a lot of resources they can use for this kind of international fund for rebuilding Sinjar, and also for implementation of transitional justice, reparation, reconciliation process, different kind of bringing justice, also moral justice to the victims. This is possible if there is a political wish or will. This will happen. Regarding your question, is so important that we are asking for reform in the Iraqi educational system and curricula. In my center, for example, we do peace education course for teachers and high school students, but it is just like outside of the curriculum. We just offer voluntarily peace education courses. I try to encourage the Iraqi Ministry of Education to do some kind of this project, like peace education, diversity, promoting the unified Iraqi identity. We know Iraq is a rich of identity and culture, and they can rely on their history that brings all the communities together. Unfortunately, there is no political will to change this curricula, but sometime in the opposite direction, that this kind of we are now facing some reform in the Iraqi personal status law that is going in a completely another direction, not in a direction of promoting unified community and diversity. This is unfortunately a thing that we should work on it, and as civil society, as human rights activists, but we still far away from this kind of reform. So what the Iraqi children knows about the Yazidi and Christian and Jews and Mandea and Shabak, actually nothing, nothing good.
I mean, it's been a route that actually.
Inna, do you want to make some last final comments before we
Inna?
close?
Yeah, I think Mirza exhausted a lot of it, and there is still, again, like as I said at the beginning, there is still a lot like that can be done through school curricula, through integrating testimonies from Yazidi religious leaders about the roots of the religion, about the history of the seven angels, like where does the mythology come from? What is the story of the black snake? And all of this symbolism is extremely important, like to tackle these misperceptions. Like you see like one image that can be very emotive, like that can evoke something completely contradictory because you come from a different context. And that's why in a country as diverse as Iraq, I think it's obligatory like to really think more innovative about like the way of teaching the history of these minorities, what these minorities have gone through. I remember when I was in Mosul and I was discussing there, like what are the traces of Yezidi Mirza, like the one Yezidi governor of Mosul, and there isn't many. There isn't like there isn't anything commemorating like that. There is this also footprint. That there was a Yazidi governor of the city. On terms of control that's being exercised in terms of preaching, of course, like in the context of Shia religiosity, where you have a marja, where you have Grand Ayatollah As-Sistani, the engagement has been much more constructive. Like there has been serious engagement from the Hausa, like for the Yezidi case. There has been even statements like from the Hausa that the protection of Yezidi is our responsibility. Problem comes, of course, like with preachers that can go uncontrolled, like on internet, on social media channels, and really like exploits the level of misinformation about the religion. But also, like as Mirza said, it's not just the case about the Yazidi, it's really how much is being known about the Mandaean, about the people of John the Baptist, about like their perception of the Iraqi ecosystem and the Iraqi water. Like there is so much beautiful mythology like that can bring people together, that does not need to be divisive. And I think really like through the path of heritage, through the path of cultural exchanges, you know, like visits in between provinces, one can really work towards promoting, nurturing a shared pride in this heritage. And I think this is something that's already happening, that's already being embraced by civil society actors. And I think like here, both the Iraqi government, but also the international society can be much more active in supporting, in scaling these initiatives.
Thank you. Yes.
Is it?
Last,
Can I-
last comment
Okay.
before we close.
But yeah, thank you for the great questions. Also, just very, very quickly add on education. If we didn't already stress the point, it's not necessarily even just education of Yazidis, but there's so much need for education for Yazidis and other young children in camps. And the question that we get asked all the time when we go to camps is, how can I study abroad, or scholarships or further education? There's just so few pathways, and that's a key part of the YSL, and it's just not being addressed. And then on what the international community can do, I mean, I would say no to the UN Security Council, which has basically embezzled best part of $200 million on UNITAD, which did not work. You know, could it acknowledge what it got wrong? Would be a really good start. Maybe even dare to learn some lessons. I think the biggest need at the moment is this massive lack of dialogue between NGOs, activists, Yazidis specifically, and the federal government in Baghdad. There are very few ties. You know, there's Khalaf Sanjari, he's kind of a bit of a bridge, but at the end of the day, the best thing probably I'd suggest the international community can do is be a bit of a broker between the two, because all of these solutions have to come from Iraq. So that's really where they should be focusing their effort, is what I'd say. And good luck with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. I hope you join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. And Inna online, of course. Thank you so much. And please don't forget to fill out the comment cards, and see you next time.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.